Welcome to the Deep 404. Ochakov, which is a township to the east of Odessa, is coming under attack from Russian heavy artillery, unmanned kamikaze drones, and multiple launch rocket systems. Now, this is interesting because of its location. If we go to the map here, we can just have a look. I'll just show you where we are on this map. This here is Ochakov is here, and to the about 60 kilometers to the east is Odessa city there. And if we go then to the west, 50 kilometers, you've got Mykolaiv up here, and to the west of Ochakov, 80 kilometers, is Kherson city. Now, we know there's a lot of fighting going on around Krinky, just to the east of Kherson at the moment. But this is interesting. Ochakov hasn't been under attack by the Russians for some time. In the past, it has. Last year it was. Earlier, there has been some attacks, but it hasn't been of late. Now, this appears to be in perhaps the early stages of a softening up activity to attack Ochakov. Now, it guards the mouth here into the Dniprovska Gulf, and the river, which is the Pivdennyi river, which runs up to Mikolaiev. So the Russians putting pressure on here now, and the thinking is that this is being done to draw in support, to draw in some reserves, to draw in some retaliatory attack, some protection for this area, and in doing so to identify around the Odessa and Mikolaiev area where Ukrainian forces are. The idea is that by putting pressure here, the Russians will be able to determine where Ukrainian headquarters are, ammunition dumps, staging locations, that sort of thing, to give them intelligence about this area and what would be needed if the Russians were to embark upon an assault of Odessa itself. Reportedly in this area of Ochakov is where NATO and primarily UK support troops are reportedly operating naval drones, so unmanned drones, which are then used, of course, to go across across the Black Sea and attack Crimea, Sevastopol port, that sort of thing, even send them out from here towards the Kerch Bridge. So it does feel as though that Odessa is going to be taken by the Russians. Now, there has been some reports coming out just this week by Seymour Hersh. Now, Seymour Hersh is, has been an investigative journalist for many years and has reported on many things. He is suggesting that there is some Ukrainian and Russian back-channel discussions going on at the moment about peace talks. That those peace talks may include halting the fighting at the current lines where they are. While I think Seymour Hersh has done a lot of really good work on this particular point, I just wonder who his source is. And the reason I wonder this is that at this point of time, I don't see why the Russians would choose to agree to a ceasefire along the current lines. I feel that if the Russians are going to push to have NATO demilitarized, NATO to have Ukraine demilitarized and have Ukraine agree that they will not join NATO, those things would need to be offered. And if they're not offered, that Russia will continue to push. Now, at this stage, some of the discussion is that there would be an allowance for Ukraine to still join NATO. That seems to be at complete odds with what Russia is after. So if Ukraine is attempting to negotiate that at the moment, a halting of fighting, a drawing up of the lines where they are now, with new borders there, but Ukraine gets to join NATO. I don't think the Russians will agree to it. So I imagine that what we have heard perhaps from Seymour Hersh is perhaps in part correct in that there may be negotiations going on, but I don't feel that those negotiations are going to be, say, successful and secure for Ukraine, a halting of the offensive this time. And again, I think that this activity we're seeing now on Ochakov in the Odessa and Mikolaiev region lends weight to the fact that those negotiations, if they are going on, and they quite possibly are, won't be successful. If we look around now here, this is a shipping tracking website that you can go to, and it just gives you a bit of an indication as I zoom out here, and I will just hide myself for a moment. But you can see all of these little dots here. These indicate boats. So if we look over here near the Kerch Strait, you can see plenty of shipping activity over here. If we zoom out a little further and let the map reload, you can see through the Mediterranean heaps and heaps of activity. As we come up into the Black Sea up here, you can see there is activity on the Russian side, and here there is activity as far as the Danube River. Now, the Danube River forms the border with Romania, between Ukraine and Romania here, but as we move north of here, there is nothing. There's no activity going on in the Odessa and Mikolaiev ports. This is in contrast to what Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg reported earlier this week, where he said Ukraine has successfully pushed the Russians back out of the Black Sea and established grain shipping routes. This is just not happening. As you can see, this is like a real-time updating, freely accessible website that anyone can see, and you can track shipping around the planet here. So as you can see, there's really nothing going on in this area. So the Russians shutting down the Odessa ports like this obviously inflicts severe economic hardship upon Ukraine. And if these ports were to be reopened, you would imagine that there would be, for the Ukrainians, a great jump in revenue. Hence, these ports of Odessa and Mikolaiev in this area are economically vitally important. And this is why I think that the Russians will ultimately push across to Moldova and to the Danube and capture this port area of Mykolaiv and Odessa as well. Doing so just seems to make sense in terms of ensuring that the new Ukraine that is or forms after this war or special military operation concludes is one that is weakened and no longer a threat to Russia. If Russia were to leave Ukraine with these ports, then this area is wide open at any stage to contraband, weapons, whatever it might be being brought in, and it is an avenue for Ukraine to generate revenue, which of course can then be used to rebuild and fortify and arm the country. So my personal feeling is that Odessa will ultimately fall to the Russians. Just on that point there around the ports, of course the ports have been instrumental in this war for the ability to ship grain out of them, and for what has been claimed many times by the Russians that they've been used to ship contraband, weapons, perhaps drone components in and out of the ports of Odessa. In terms of grain, it's being reported by Eurostat that purchases of Russian grain have increased by 22% over the month and 10 times over the last year, which is now allowed Russia to enter the top 5 largest grain suppliers to the EU. So even while this conflict is going on and while there are sanctions in place, Russia has now moved into 4th place as the 4th largest supplier of grain to the EU. Now, again, this is due to the fact that Ukraine is struggling to ship grain. It's far easier for Ukraine to ship bulk quantities of grain via ports and sea-based shipping rather than over land. We know that the bulk of Ukrainian grain goes to EU, the European nations. And now there will be, what grain there is able to be moved out of Ukraine will be being moved by train and by truck, which is much slower and more expensive. So for those reasons, EU nations are now purchasing Russian grain because they'll be able to purchase it at a far better price than purchasing it from Ukraine. Trade for Russia, in general, is growing, even though the sanctions have been put in place by the Western nations. Turnover between Russia and China has exceeded what was planned by those two nations. It looks like it's going to hit $220 billion since the beginning of this year. Russia and China had thought that they would get to $200 billion in trade. It looks like they're going to exceed that. The largest components of the export from China to Russia are trucks, excavators, loaders, and rubber tires. As you can imagine, the bulk of these will be for military purposes. Trucks, of course, for moving all the material around that you need to move when you're moving troops and material. Loaders, these large low loaders, things that you can put tanks on and drive them around through urban areas without destroying the roads. Excavators for reinforcing, fortifying, digging trenches, that type of thing, and rubber tires. Rubber tires, interesting. This agrees with what I was reporting on yesterday, that while Germany is suffering an exodus of its tyre manufacturing industry from the country with shutdowns of a number of major tyre manufacturers, that is due to competition from China and energy prices. So here we see that China is also supplying rubber tyres into Russia. In return, Russia is sending mostly gas, oil, and coal. So Germany now, because it has an inability to get cheap energy, inability to get Russian gas cheaply, and turn its nuclear power generation systems off, it's losing its ability to produce tyres. And here we have Russia and China. Russia providing China with cheap energy, which is then in turn producing tyres and providing them back to Russia for its war effort. There are some delays reported for the Ukrainians in terms of some weapon systems they were going to be receiving from the US. This is the ground-launched small-diameter bomb, or the GLSDB. It has now been delayed until early 2024. It is a small rocket being built by Saab and Boeing, gives a 160-kilometer range. It is a GPS-enabled bomb. So you fire the bomb with a little rocket system from the ground, and then it's GPS-enabled. It is speculated that the reason for the delay now of them being supplied is that because they are GPS-enabled, they are now coming under jamming from Russian electronic warfare capabilities, and that the delay is so that a secondary targeting system can be developed and attached to these weapons to allow them to operate as they are intended to be a targeted, guided bomb, even if they're unable to rely on GPS because of some of the Russian electronic warfare capabilities. As I mentioned, the Russians do seem to be increasing their capabilities here, with some reporting coming out this week indicating them able to disrupt in the visual band satellite imagery over an area. So they're using some sort of electronic warfare interference to cover the locations of equipment, to be able to cover visually, anyhow from satellites, the ability to look down and see where you might have air defence or where you might have troops deployed. Arestovich. So Oleksiy Arestovich, who's a former advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky, he has begun to rise as perhaps a fourth competitor for power in the power struggle that's going on. Yesterday I mentioned how there's Zelensky, General Zaluzhny, Kirillov Bodanov, who was the head of the military intelligence service, but Arestovich has also spoken and mentioned that he's called for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, and that he would consider running for office for president. There is obviously conflict between Arestovich and Zelensky, and there seems to be no love lost between the pair. Arestovich has been very critical of Zelensky and what he's been doing over the last few months. So whether he is perhaps looking for a spot in presidency, who knows? Again, he's been very close as an advisor to President Zelensky, so no doubt has information which he could use to Zelensky's detriment in any sort of competitive run for the presidency. What Arestovich has said just this week, which is interesting, is he's been quoted as saying, "Our problem is this. Let me give you some figures. 100 people have left military units per day in Ukraine. That's where 100 people per day. That's a brigade per month." So he's talking here about people who are deserting and just leaving from their military units at 100 a day. Now, if this is true, if Arestovich is right, then that is adding to the fact that Ukraine has reportedly, and this is coming from the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, so make your own decision as to whether you believe this number or not, but he has suggested that Ukraine has lost, killed or wounded in the last 6 months 125,000 men. Now, if you double that out, that's 250,000 men across a year. That is at least consistent what we have seen reported from the Russian Ministry of Defense over the course of this conflict. They do report on a daily basis what they believe to be the military and material losses of the Ukrainian armed forces. I will later in this episode I will give the weekly update of what they're reporting to. But early this week, in one of the reports I did a rough calculation based on. A week ago, we saw reported 4,000 Ukrainian killed and wounded. A week before that, 5,000. Averaging that sort of out, I said, over the course of a year, you'd be looking at 230 to 250,000 killed and wounded. So this lines up, as I say, at least it is consistent, the reporting coming from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, you contrast that with what is perhaps the best data we have on Russian losses. And this comes from the Media Zona, which is a group of volunteers who are working with the BBC, so the British BBC, and they are using various means, open source means, to try to determine the number of Russian killed, the Russian military fatalities in the conflict. They're doing this by monitoring Telegram channels, by monitoring newspapers in Russia, by finding whatever open source information they can about funerals and obituaries, and trying to match them up and normalize them to get numbers. Now, there's obviously, this will probably indicate a lower limit. There will be some that they have missed, so the numbers that they get are higher. But as of the 3rd of November, so just 1 month ago, they are reporting that for Russian military, as best that they can estimate, the number stands at 35,780 killed. Now, this excludes casualties from the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So If we were to, add this on and say 20,000, you're 35, you're 55,000, say 60,000, you might be at 60 or 70,000, I suppose, over the, now just remember, this is over the course of the conflict is what they are estimating out. And this is probably the best estimate and data we have for Russian. Now, so this is killed. So let's say 70,000 over the course of the war. If you then consider the fact that clearly Ukraine is losing in the conflict at this stage, Russia is advancing all along the front line. Russia has more military production, it has more shells, and this is reported by Ukrainian forces. They're reporting that they are unable to retaliate with the number of shells that they used to, and that they are still seeing a heavy barrage of Russian artillery sent their way. We see daily reports, video confirmed reports of Ukrainian men being killed by FPV drones and artillery strikes. There was a report that I saw coming out from Military Summary channel from DEMA there, talking about one FPV drone pilot or group who had over a couple of week period reportedly confirmed with video the estimated death of about 60 Ukrainian soldiers and the wounding of another 30 to 40. So it was about 100 killed and wounded in a 2-week period. And interestingly, the number of killed was estimated as being higher than the number of wounded. And this was from one drone pilot, or at least one group of drone pilots operating in one area. So that's a very high number of killed and wounded to be enacted by perhaps one person, perhaps a group, but perhaps just one pilot, just using multiple of these small FPV drones and sending them out. So we've got video footage of that, a 2-week period, 60 dead, maybe up to 100 dead and wounded, and perhaps some of those wounded will die. So it might be 80. Very high kill to wounded ratio, video evidence of this, and just from one team or one person. So if that is happening across the line, then you see that these Russian Ministry of Defense claims of 4,000, 5,000 killed in a week over some of the previous weeks are possible. So if we're starting then from a position that the Russians may have lost 70,000 killed, you've got to now wonder what the numbers are like for the Ukrainians over the course of the war. And I can't see any way that it can be lower than the Russian number. And based upon what I've seen over reading and watching this conflict over the last year or so, it must be far higher. So numbers of 125,000 troops lost while this is killed and wounded in a 6-month period sounds possible. And if that's in a 6-month period, the fighting's been going for 18, nearly 22 months, I suppose. It'll be 24 months in February. So that's not to say that there's the same amount over that entire time, but 6 months, 125, if you times that by 4, you're at 500,000 killed and wounded. So, you might be looking at 250,000 killed Ukrainians in this conflict and another 250,000 wounded. I can't say exactly, but you can see how we're getting those order of magnitude of numbers, and there seems to be some justification for them. Simply by taking the Russian number and then understanding that the Russians have the upper hand in this conflict and have had for a long time. And so surely then the Ukrainians must be suffering at a higher rate. And there's all that video evidence showing confirmed killing and wounding of Ukrainian soldiers. So this is not good news for the Ukrainians. Put on top of this, the announcement this week, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree establishing and authorizing a growth in the Russian military, from taking them from about 1.9 million in total to over 2.2 million. This will see an increase of 170,000 people, and will push the combat military personnel up to 1.3 million people. Again, over the last few months, we have had multiple reports that the Russian army has been growing in size without a forced mobilization, and that they have had large numbers of volunteers, people volunteering to join, as opposed to Ukraine, where we've seen ample video footage of forced mobilization tactics, people being beaten up, thrown into vans, this type of thing. We're already seeing now in Ukraine video evidence of women on the front line, and women now being killed on the front line of the Ukrainian forces. Yeah, it's not looking good, and you can see how this is happening across the line. All across the line, there are reports, and I'll get to that in a moment. There are reports that Russia is advancing in Krasny Liman, the Terney section there. There are reports of a 1.5 kilometer advance. There are reports that in some areas like this, Ukrainian forces are just deserting and retreating. We had the story from earlier this week of the second Ukrainian woman killed on the front line, who was reportedly shot by her commanding officer because she was upsetting him and the troops so much by trying to cajole them and convince them they had to go and fight, and belittling them, that they shot her. Terrible situations. Pressure mounting from the Russians all across the front line. Again, to me, this just concurs with the thinking that at some stage the Russians will be in a position, not that they are there yet, but they will be in a position to push across the Dnieper River and to push into Odessa and take Odessa. Now, I will just move on to the weekly report from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Just get my map going here. Where are we? So this is the weekly report. The Russian Ministry of Defense produce a daily update, but also once a week they do a weekly one. This is covering the period from the 25th of November to the 2nd of December. So up here, this orange line we can see here is the Kupiansk front line coming down to the Krasny Liman area. So in the Kupiansk direction, this is where units of the Zapad group of forces are operating along the front line near Sinkovka. They have this week reportedly repelled 18 Ukrainian armed force attacks. The Russians have reportedly inflicted losses on the AFU, which is the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, 57th Motorized Infantry Brigade, the 14th, the 43rd, the 53rd, and the 67th Mechanized Brigades near Sinkovka, Ivanovka, and Kislovka in the Kharkov region. The Ministry of Defense reports that Ukrainian losses have amounted to more than 315 troops, 2 tanks, 8 armoured fighting vehicles, 15 motor vehicles, and 7 field artillery guns. Just note that 7 artillery pieces in this area this week. I'll keep a kind of a track of those as we go through here, and I'll just talk about that a little bit at the end. Then in the Krasny Liman direction, which on our map is this lower orange and blue area, in Krasny Liman, this is where the centre group of forces are operating using aviation, artillery, and the heavy flamethrower systems, the TOS-1 flamethrowers. They have reportedly repelled 13 attacks launched by assault detachments of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the 12th Special Operations Brigade, 47th and 67th Mechanised Brigades. The enemy, or sorry, this is the Russian reporting. This is not my phraseology here. The Ukrainian losses amounted to up to 950 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, 7 armoured fighting vehicles and 21 motor vehicles. Now, as we move down to the Donetsk region, that's this blue line and this yellow line with Donetsk city here. In the Donetsk direction, where units of the Yug group of forces operate, supported by aviation and artillery, are improving tactical situations around Chornomorsk, which is the Bakhmut area. In addition, they are delivering strikes on the Ukrainian manpower and hardware near Mariinka. Now, Mariinka has reportedly all but fallen. Mariinka on our map, just here to the west of Donetsk. Mariinka has been battled over since 2014. It has been in Ukrainian control since that time, and now it appears that almost all of Mariinka has fallen to Russian control. A video emerging yesterday showing a Russian flag flown over one of the remaining houses in the northwestern area of Mariinka. Klishchiivka, also in Klishchiivka, which is just south of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have managed to now force the Ukrainians out of the northern parts of Klishchiivka. Over the past week, 25 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces were repelled, and the Ministry of Defence reports that more than 1,680 Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded in Donetsk, 6 tanks destroyed, 6 armoured fighting vehicles, 31 motor vehicles, and 19 field artillery guns destroyed. As we move to the South Donetsk region, which is this yellow area through here, in South Donetsk direction, this is where the Vostok group of forces are operating. Reportedly here, the Ukrainian losses are more than 880 troops, 1 tank, 6 armoured fighting vehicles, 20 motor vehicles, and 5 field artillery guns. Then, as we move to the Zaporozhye region, which is here, is our green section. Here, the Russian groups of forces have engaged in intensive defence, during which they've repelled 14 attacks near Robotny and Verbova. The reports indicate that the Russian forces have been engaged in battles with the AFU's 71st Jaeger Brigade, the 82nd Assault Brigade, the 33rd, 65th and 118th Mechanised Brigades near Malaya Tokmacha, which is up in this area just north of Robotny and Verbova. Reportedly, the Ukrainian losses have amounted to more than 315 Ukrainian troops, 5 tanks, 7 armoured vehicles, 21 motor vehicles, as well as 5 field artillery guns. And then as we move to Kherson, here, in the Kherson direction, the Ukrainian troops made unsuccessful attempts to land infantry on the left bank of the Dnieper. Due to the preventative actions of the Russian forces using artillery fire assaults, Ukrainian forces have lost up to 450 servicemen killed or wounded, 13 field artillery guns, 23 boats and 26 motor vehicles, and 2 sabotage and reconnaissance groups have been eliminated. In addition, units of the 35th, 36th and 37th Marine Brigades have been struck in the Kherson region. In addition to this, 14 Ukrainian servicemen were taken prisoner in this direction. Finally, in general, across the front line, 6 P-18 radar stations reportedly destroyed, and air defence systems have shot down 8 aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force during this week, 5 MiG-29s, 2 Su-27s, 1 Su-25, as well as 1 Mi-8 helicopter. So Again, this is Russian Ministry of Defense reporting, so choose to believe it with the level of skepticism you feel is appropriate. But if it is accurate, then this has been, again, quite a devastating week for the Ukrainians. Not only large numbers of men killed and wounded, but also in counting up the artillery pieces reportedly lost, that number's 49, almost 50 pieces in this week. Now, earlier in the conflict, this was something that was sustainable for the Ukrainians as they were receiving military replacements for these from NATO nations. Now they are not. Now the main piece of military equipment which is still being supplied to Ukraine is air defense systems, but in terms of self-propelled artillery and artillery pieces, these just aren't things that the Ukrainians can now easily replace. So week on week, we are now going to see, I think, the Ukrainian losses growing in terms of equipment loss and men lost, or alternatively, we're going to see continued evidence of the Ukrainian front line being pushed backwards by the Russians as their troops are unable to defend themselves and need to fall back to defensive positions, which, as we see reported this week, President Zelensky has finally understood and announced that the Ukrainian forces, the offensive has failed and is over, and they do need to assume defensive positions. As I've said, this, I think, is clearly obvious, but is also perhaps being influenced by the US desire to see Ukraine go quiet, hold the line, not crumble and fall, so that the US government can get through to the November 2024 election and try to re-elect President Biden. If Ukraine goes to bits now because they don't set up suitable defensive positions and they're overrun, that will be bad for President Biden's likelihood. And so the recent trip by CIA Director Bill Burns quite possibly was to impress upon President Zelensky that he needs to defend now. He's not going to get the sort of funding that he's had in the past, but if he can survive through until November 2024 and Biden gets back in, more money will come then. Okay, that's it for today. Look, I hope you're having a good weekend. If you are enjoying the channel and you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. If you think you know someone who would enjoy the channel, please share and like the video, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.